This is a webinar devoted to Trump 2.0 as part of an explainer series that Ingrid Brunk, my co-editor-in-chief, and I are hosting through the American Journal of International Law, associated with our October 2025 issue, in which we have a series of essays, including one by Jorge Contese, who is our guest today and a member of our board, who has written a piece about Trump 2.0, the view from Latin America. So without further ado, Jorge, let me just jump in. Thank you for being here. And tell us, what is the view from Latin America in 5 minutes?
Thank you both for organizing this, and um, I'll do my best. It's not easy to reflect on this in 5 minutes, but I would say, just to reiterate what I say in my piece, that what we are now seeing is an overt sort of interventionist and aggressive attitude towards Latin America from the United States that we have not seen in a very long time. So many people, and I think quite rightly, are pointing to 1989, the invasion in Panama, um, the notion that right now, as we are doing this webinar, it's early December, and the conversation is what's happening in terms of the use of force by the United States, the actual use of force. So the something what I tried to do in my essay was to combine different ways in which the United States, under the Trump administration, the second Trump administration, is intervening and interfering in Latin America affairs. Now, that's nothing new. That's the story of the United States and the region in Latin America. But this sort of marked um, and sort of very hostile and aggressive and without any seeming constraints is something that, in my view, is quite new. It's quite unprecedented, at least as we could have thought of the second Trump administration as we were coming into this new era.
So just tell us, please, Jorge, if you wouldn't mind spelling out a little bit, what is the United States doing in Latin America for those who are not paying attention or reading this particular facet of what's happening in the world right now? And you say that the turn toward becoming more aggressive is like the shift. So what are the specific indicators of that, and where in Latin America are we seeing it most?
Right. So let me step back a little bit and say that it's not just the sort of being aggressive. I think that's, in a way, that's always been a sort of a mechanism, a way of engaging with Latin America. It's the overt hostility that we are seeing. It's that it's not um, caution in any significant way. It's out there, and we are seeing it in certainly in what's happening in the Caribbean with the strikes and the use of force, which occupies part of my essay, but also in what is very concerning, how the Trump administration is engaging with elections, with presidential elections that are happening, with presidential elections that took place, or how, for example, in the case of Argentina, how Trump said we really need this, result in the legislative sort of midterm elections, um, and how that is creating some movement in the region. Again, in a way that is overt. Same with interference in sort of judicial politics. I use the case of Brazil, um, to show how, by way of sanctions and sort of putting pressure, and actively supporting someone, former president of Brazil, Jair Bolsonaro, who's been convicted as an instigator of nothing less than a coup d'état, and you have the administration saying, well, that's a quote, a witch hunt, and publishing a letter and saying we really need to stop this in ways that are, again, to me, um, sort of uniquely overt, that no one is trying to hide what they're doing. And so I hope that viewers can see that there are different levels in which this is happening, right? The sort of the dramatic use of force, people are being killed in the Caribbean in what, under international human rights law, is clearly an extrajudicial execution, right? But also in these sort of more diplomatic ways in which summits are being canceled because the US is putting pressure, but also by way of imposing sanctions against a sitting member of the Supreme Court of Brazil. That's also unprecedented, and that's creating, different forms of reaction. And I can talk more about how Latin American leaders react to these different ways in which the United States engages now with the region. Some are very pragmatic, some are quite confrontational, and others are just praising what the U.S. is doing.
Before we turn to the details of some of this, including the use of force, let me, it's so interesting. I'm for one surprised by the prominence of Latin America in the second Trump administration. I would have expected a lot more focus on China, for example. And when we think about the move to Latin America or the shift to focus in policy, I have two questions about that, and they're related. One is, does it make sense to think of Latin America as like a region in any political sense, or is it just a collection of countries that President Trump is, like every other president, but in a somewhat different way, just evaluating his likelihood of extracting some value or benefit, and there's nothing about the region. And then relatedly, a lot of the rhetoric that came out at the very beginning of the second Trump administration, it was about Panama, it was about Greenland, right? And and it was about, Gaza. And, some of this has had a lot of staying power and some of it has kind of faded away. Is his approach just really opportunistic? Like just throwing out a lot of stuff and seeing where there's a place to do something that benefits the United States. Your thoughts on that would be helpful because I'm trying to puzzle through that and I'm not sure how to think about it.
So those are great questions. First, Latin America is not Europe. It we don't we tend to talk about Latin America as a single sort of a compact thing that has its own sort of Latin American law, which kind of makes sense. Um, but certainly when it comes to the subject of our conversation, the way the Trump administration engages with the region, I think it's the parallel with Europe is quite striking. There's Latin America is a divided region in general, but it's particularly divided when it comes to how Latin American countries are engaging with the Trump administration. And that's what I was just referring to. So you have countries such as, I don't know, Paraguay and Argentina and Ecuador, in the Caribbean, Trinidad and Tobago, like countries that are praising what the Trump administration has been doing, even before the Trump administration started in January. Um, those are completely aligned with sort of MAGA and Trump agenda. You have other countries that are quite pragmatic. I think the best example that I can think of is Mexico, which is interesting because it's the closest, right? It's just there, and somehow President Sheinbaum from Mexico has had this remarkable way of engaging with the Trump administration that you have Donald Trump praising her as a person, even though they haven't met personally, at the same time as saying, horrible things about what's happening in Mexico and, the drug trafficking and all of that. But they seem to manage a way in which they can um, relate with the United States, similar to what Brazil does or Chile. And then you have countries that are obviously confrontational. Venezuela, of course, but also Colombia. And I forgot to mention El Salvador, which is kind of the poster child of having an ally to date um, to the Trump administration's agenda. So it's important, not to think of Latin America as this one company in the same way, in the way that I think we tend to think of Europe in the middle of, Russia, then this is Europe, and what is Europe going to do with this new way in which the United States is engaging, geopolitically in global affairs. Um, so that's the sort of the starting point. There's no Latin American sort of view. Um, there are different ways in which different countries and blocs are seeing what works for them, rather than like a single Latin American, position. And then I think your second question, Ingrid, in terms of an opportunistic approach, um, I'm not sure. I think that uh, when I started writing this essay, my sort of intuition was, well, many of the things that I'm seeing here, the way in which the Trump administration is referring to things, to problems, to places, to even leaders, is just, fireworks, and it's going to pass, and then we're going to focus on what's really important. And you were talking about tariffs and China, but then again, because this conversation is taking place in a specific context, and viewers in months, maybe years, when we come back to this moment in which we were trying to assess first, is there any legal authority for the United States to engage in use of force in the Caribbean? Um, there are many people who are seeing this move in the direction of regime change in Venezuela. I would say for both political, sort of substantive, ideological reasons. We don't like Maduro. He's a dictator. He stole the 2024 election. The Nobel Prize winner, Maria Corina Machado, she's the person who, should run the country. Um, and this is sort of, it's not a humanitarian intervention kind of argument, but if we wanted to put it in its best light, it would be something along those lines. And then there's a non sort of substantive, or rather pragmatic, opportunistic argument that there's oil, and people are saying, well, if we oust this, if we remove Maduro, not only it's going to be good for the Venezuelan people who have been suffering, and Latin America has been suffering the consequences of the Maduro regime and the Chavez regime for years now, but it's also going to be good for what this administration seems to care a lot, which is transactional. It's natural resources. I don't have more evidence that it's out there, so it's not my field of expertise, but I just want to put things that may help us think, similar to what we started to think about how the United States engaged in the Iraq War in the early 2000s. Like, there were no weapons of mass destruction, and yet we waged a war that lasted for so many years. Is that what we're witnessing now, just in Latin America? I have to say, and I'll finish here for now, but I wish that the attention was not in the region. It's like these are the type of things that you wish that it was not happening. It's dramatic. It's not good what's happening, among other things, because the region is so divided, and there's no one position to support or to sort of resist what the United States is doing. Sorry, Monica.
No, not at all. Thank you. I just wanted to ask two follow-up questions based on what you just said, and maybe to put your comments now in conversation with some of the themes in international legal scholarship, both relating to Latin America and not. So one of the things that people sometimes say about Latin America, which seems to be substantiated through history, is that Latin America was very much at the forefront of establishing some of the norms on sovereignty and territorial integrity, and that this was sort of like a regional push to in the process of Latin America's decolonization. And I guess so the first question is, are your comments about its sort of fragmented response to the United States reflective of like the fact that that shared commitment to territorial integrity, sovereignty, certain conceptions of statehood has dissipated, and that states in the region no longer solidify around that category of issues? And then the second question is about the situation in Venezuela and the regime change, and whether you could, like you might remember there was this whole conversation about like pro-democracy uses of force to advance democracy in the 1990s, and then it sort of like dissipated. And part of the resistance to that, of course, was that, well, states that are pushing for democracy will have pretextual reasons for citing like an effort to advance democracy, and will sow all sorts of problems. And Iraq 2003 seemed to be the paradigm case of like, okay, yeah, this is a failed effort. So do you think those sort of moves toward like those pro-democracy moves are actually re-expressing themselves here, or that this is just a top-down like effort by the people in power to get rid of someone they don't like? And so like how does that make you think about that sort of broader conversation about whether international law does or should support democracy, and if it does or should, through what means it does so?
Again, two huge questions. What I think it's interesting is that they're actually connected, and I can think of a response to both questions by way of just saying sort of one thing, which is um, you're right that Latin America prides itself of this tradition, of non-intervention, and many of the sort of, for legal historians, tracing how sort of the regional organizations, particularly in the mid 20th century, the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights and early efforts to organize Latin America as a sort of a regional bloc, they that how that was a direct response to the, again, interventionist and aggressive attitude of this new superpower, right? The United States. I mean, Latin America is right. We're just, we're neighbors. Um, and so for Latin American countries, international legal historians have documented how important it was to have this. International law was the way that they could somehow resist a little bit of that hostility, which many times was manifested in ways that were much more diplomatic than what we're seeing today. I think that commitment to those sort of Latin American principles, uh, to a large extent, still exist, of course, but they have significantly shifted because of sort of a larger movement away from those principles in sort of in a global at a global scale, not just in the region. And that's why I say, your second question is also I can address it by way of answering your first question. Um, because what I think it's impossible to um, talk about these issues and what you're asking without taking into consideration how, and you've been writing about this recently, Monica, how we've been sort of walking away from the basic principles of the international legal order that we founded, just 80 years ago. So you were talking about the 90s. Many people think, and I think, to some extent rightly, that was the very short sort of golden age of the UN Security Council actually doing its work and serving as the core organ of the UN Charter and stopping aggression and addressing hostilities. And then we have a sort of a downfall, which I think it's just a matter of seeing what's been happening in the recent past. I always read to my students the speech that Vladimir Putin gave 2 days before the February 2022 invasion into Ukraine. And the reason I do this is because one, I think is as an educational piece, it's really interesting to see how he's calling out the West and the United States in particular, and citing Kosovo and citing a number of sort of things that happened in the past 2 or 3 decades to show that what they're doing is not necessarily different from what the West has been doing under the idea of R2P, humanitarian intervention. To your second question, the promotion of democracy, how important that is. And if one tries to read this in a sort of good light, uh, there's some plausibility to what he's saying. That how can we subject to how can we hold to account someone when what's been happening on the other side has been so dramatic, that the consequences are so grave. So this is not to condone the actions of Russia or anyone for that matter. It's simply to say that Latin Americans sort of walking away as a bloc from these principles of non-intervention, the respect of sovereignty, things that were so dear to the Latin American countries as a bloc in the mid 20th century, the the notion of using force to promote democracy, that's not separate from the discussions and conversations that we've been having sort of at a global scale. That's why I'm bringing the example of Russia in 2022. Um, that's the drama, I think. Now that the United Nations has just turned 80 years and we're in this crisis again that you both have written about. Um, and we're sort of entering into this new world. There will be a new Secretary General, and we don't really know how this new era of this global architecture will look like. So for Latin America, that has real consequences because now we have once again this divided region without the strong commitment to principles that were so obvious that Latin American countries, whether right or left, didn't matter. Now that commitment is, as you're suggesting, is not there as it used to be.
Can I just ask what, do you want to ask along this?
No, yeah, I do have something along these lines, but go ahead.
Go ahead. Okay. I'll ask a real quick question, then Ingrid will ask a question. You can answer them together. So, do you think that's because the promise of statehood has been unrealized for so many, and that they're realizing like actually they need, like for example, had the new international economic order been more
Yeah.
successful, then these states would have been more like stronger independent entities able to defending themselves, capable of defending themselves, and not so vulnerable to trying to sort of impress a new American president that was eager to show his dominance. And that the fragility of these states, and the sort of like the limits of the statehood enterprise have contributed to the lack of commitment to the program, basically, and a dissipation and the fragmentation that you've described. So I guess that's the question. And then Ingrid, go ahead.
This is sort of related, but or I think related. One of the interesting things about Putin's speech, and I think this gets back to sort of how we characterize or how we think about Latin America as a region. I've always thought the primary audience for Putin's speech is obviously domestic, but it's also like India and Brazil, right? It's giving countries who have an economic incentive to continue to trade with Russia a plausible reason to stay out of the conflict. And it may not seem very convincing necessarily to a lot of Western viewers, but that, to my mind, wasn't the audience, right? The audience again is countries like Brazil and India,
Mm.
which makes me think about the new the polarized global order and how we think of Latin America in the context of the BRICS, and whether we really are seeing a global instrumentalism, right? Where countries are like, I'm going to trade with whoever makes me most wealthy right now. I don't have any particular allegiance to the United States. I don't have any particular allegiance to Russia or China. I'm just going to make decisions that benefit me in a transactional sense, which may be an outgrowth of the phenomena that Monica was describing. And I'm just curious if you see it that way. And if you do, is that like negative? I mean, I understand there's a lot of like bad
Mm.
things happening, but like, is
Yeah.
that dynamic itself, like, maybe, is that good? I don't know.
Right. Right. Let me just start with that last question. And um, in September 2023, uh, the UN Secretary General, in his speech to the General Assembly, he talked about how it was necessary to reform UN institutions, but he was referring to the UN Security Council. And one of the main reasons was we live in a world that it's multipolar, it's not the world as it used to be in 1946, and needs to change, and we haven't changed. And I think this connects to to your remark, to your comment, Ingrid, because um, I don't think that it was just that it was and it is just a transactional thing that whoever will do business with me and that's going to be, more, I'll make more money, then I'll go with. And if that's China, then I'll go with China. If that's Russia, then or I'll just stay with the United States. Um, there's legal scholarship which has studied how the US was very conscious in promoting ideas in Latin America in the 1960s, 1970s. So the whole law and development literature and how they, for example, funded through Fulbright, through other mechanisms, and American legal scholars were traveling to Latin America and were conducting we're doing real work to promote the rule of law and to promote legal reform. And that took at least 2 or 3 decades, with some interruptions because of political developments in the region. My point is, it was not just a question of, well, it's convenient to do business with the United States, but it was also a sort of substantive, ideological, we think alike kind of way in which Latin American countries engage with the United States. Some countries, much more than others, Argentina's constitution is, based, if not copied, out of the United States Constitution, and the model of judicial review, which is quite unique for Latin America. And so there is this sort of thinking that we're not just neighbors, but the influence of the United States, political culture and political theory, if you will, has been real in the region. And the fact that the United States is part of the Americas, that's why it's part of the Organization of American States, that's why it has to appear before the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights, has importance, or has had importance, or I would say used to have a lot more importance than now, that we have this world in which Russia and China and others will say, well, let's do business. Who are you? Who's paying attention to you today? And if you take a look around what's happening in the region in Latin America, well, Chinese business, I mean, China is the largest commercial trade partner of a number of countries, if not everyone in the region. So when that changes, once again, this goes back to Monica's question, the sort of political, cultural, ideological commitment that we had tends to blur a little bit. It is now much more transactional, even though the United States has, of course, a lot of influence. But that influence, I would say, it's not just the type of influence that it used to be. It has influence in those countries that are, that are seen as allies, Paraguay and Argentina and Ecuador and El Salvador, because they adhere to the same principles, whatever those principles are. But because the world is now, this multipolar space, Latin America is saying, why do we have to keep, why do we need to stick with these folks who have been doing all of this? Lula saying, we already forgave the United States for what they did in Brazil in 1964 or Chile in 1973. Why do we have to keep doing business as usual with people who are invading us and meddling into our politics, when these other people who doesn't seem to have the same intention and are offering, trade and exchanges, might do as well for us than we used to do with the United States. I think that's changing.
Go ahead, Mike. I think that's consistent. That's really helpful, Jorge, the history especially, and that's kind of it makes sense. It's also just in some ways maybe a rational reaction to a newly transactional approach from the United States, right? The response to that might be to be quite transactional in response. I have two more specific areas that I thought,
Sure.
or maybe three, depending on how much time we have. It would be nice to talk just a little bit about human rights. You're one of the world's leading experts on human rights, and we haven't focused specifically on that. The second thing is to just a little bit more about like Brazil. And like, why are we doing what we're doing in Brazil? Like, what is that just a personal issue with President Trump, or does it fit in some broader scheme? And then the third is I think it makes sense to just talk a little bit about the use of force, interdicting alleged narco traffickers, and killing people on board. So those are three more specific areas that we might dive into. Maybe again trying to think of them in these broader themes. Is there a broader theme, or is it just sort of whatever is important to the president on any given day?
Yeah,
But that's a big menu to choose from.
that's a huge menu. Now, you just said something that I keep hearing from people who are, who know more about this than I do, which is whatever the president feels sort of one day, they're like, there's no real strategy necessarily. Um, so in terms of human rights, that's just to stay with my essay. I think that it was relevant to see the United States engaging under the second Trump administration with the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights. It was not, it was unclear how the U.S. would react or act towards the regional human rights organization. In 2017, during the first Trump administration, uh, it was the first time that the U.S. did a no show. They didn't appear before the commission, and that was unprecedented. So people were somehow expecting this, particularly in the context of the United States reviewing its participation in international organizations in general, not just the OAS, the Organization of American States, but also the UN. So the U.S. Nominated a candidate, a Cuban human rights activist who was elected to the commission. And I think this is going to be interesting, not just because it signals a less confrontational approach, at least towards the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights. When the U.S. nominated Rosa Maria Payá, and she was elected, the State Department praised the work of the commission, which I at least was surprised. And they say, this is an objective organ, and it protects human rights in the region. But then when there was a hearing on asylum seeking and refugee protection and migrant protection in July, the U.S. once again said, well, the Inter-American Commission should not interfere in domestic legal issues. There's ongoing litigation, and you should stay away, which is, by the way, something that the U.S. has said in the past, not only the Trump administration. And of course, it makes no sense. I mean, if under that rationale, then all international human rights mechanisms would have to stay away from whatever way of assessing the conduct of states. I mean, human rights, we can talk so much about human rights. Everything that's connected to, and I would suggest viewers to go and take a look at Jaya's webinar on the violation of the non-refoulement principle, right? That's a core principle that's both under the 1951 Refugee Convention and the 1984 Torture Convention. And that's a huge human rights issue that is taking place right now. Like, that's a big, big issue. And by the way, the US, and I'm saying this not as a member of the Committee Against Torture, the US will probably go before the committee at some point in the coming years, and I'm sure that this will be a major issue of concern, as what we've seen happening with the mass deportation of Venezuelans to El Salvador. So that's in terms of human rights. Just to mention one thing, then on Brazil, just very briefly, this is a suspicion. I don't have evidence. But I think the role of Elon Musk in the first months of the administration should be taken into consideration, because much of the Trump administration's anger towards what Brazil was doing was connected to X and how Brazil was requiring the company to have a legal representative in the country, and they failed to do that. And after they failed to do that, because of many accounts that were spreading, disinformation, which is for another webinar of like what are the limits under, free speech, um, sort of First Amendment law. So the Trump administration said, well, you cannot do it because you are affecting people who are on U.S. soil. By shutting down these X accounts, you're affecting individuals who are on U.S. soil. So we have an interest in you not mistreating this company. I don't have any evidence on this, just following, the events that it seems like, why would the US be so interested in sanctioning people? That's one. And second, well, Bolsonaro. Bolsonaro was a huge part of the Latin American sort of embracing Trump's, methods. And he's serving time in prison now. He was convicted to 27 years in prison for instigating a coup, which even former Vice President Mike Pence said that this was the January 2023 events in Brazil reminded him of the January 2021 events in Washington, D.C. So I think one could sort of reasonably combine the two sort of strands here. And to your third question on the strikes, well, what can we say about this? Uh, it seems like what's happening is essentially the use of force without any legal justification. At least something that I say in my essay, this was published before this sort of latest developments. But the question being, okay, what's the legal authority to do this? And what I try to do is to go back in time, the strikes that began in early September of 2025. Then before that, in August, the United States deploying troops in the Caribbean, Marco Rubio, the Secretary of State, saying the only way we can sort of address the drug problem is by, quote, blowing these boats away. That's what's going to work. And how they do this, we as legal scholars should be concerned with legal authority, or the lack of legal authority for that matter, is the February 2025 designation of 9 cartels as foreign terrorist organizations by the State Department. And that was in sort of based on the executive order of January 2025 of inauguration day, that sort of lays the groundwork for first talking about an invasion, then making reference to the Alien Enemies Act. And so the idea of a war, and that the military should be deployed to address the problem of drug dealers, quote, invading the country and sort of attacking, the American people. I think that that's kind of the sequence if we try to sort of apply the law to what's happening right now as we're having this conversation.
Jorge, I wanted to ask you to put a question that we've been asking actually consistently in these webinars, which is about continuity versus change and what some of the differences are between what we're seeing now and, the first Trump administration, but US practice more generally. And we sort of began with the vague version of this question, but maybe I could ask it in a more pointed way, which is, so we had an earlier Trump administration that did a lot of things that were in disregard of international law. We had a US government that, as you said, invaded Iraq in 2003 with claims of weapons of mass destruction that ended up being non-substantiated. We've had like a long history of intervention in Latin America. And yet my sense when I hear you, when I read your piece, is that you do think that that there has been a significant turn or transformation in the nature of the US relationship with Latin America, or at least with some Latin American states. And I'm wondering if maybe we could put like a little bit of a finer point on what is what you think is new and how that what and specifically what is likely to have a lasting effect such that like we can get a sense of what the trajectory is going to go be from here. Is it your answer to Ingrid that, now we're in a more transactional world, and so whereas in the past some of these things were just like dealt with and Latin American countries basically moved on and continued their relationship with the United States, now everything is just a little bit more fragile. And so similar conduct or conduct that might fit in the same category today is not going to have the longer term ramifications of the conduct of the past. Or is it something different? So like I'm just wondering if you could like sort of place this current moment in broader trends and forecast a little bit for us where you see the relationships between the United States and Latin American countries going.
So Trump started with the so-called Muslim ban and people rushing to airports to try to help folks who were affected by those initial actions. And everyone was sort of rattled by what was happening then, right? And what I want to say is that fight, which was a legal fight, which by the way is a footnote, had an effect on law school enrollment. Many students decided to go to law school when they saw how lawyers were reacting and responding to the Trump first administration's initial actions. My essay begins with the quote invasion in the southern border. And as I was referring before, the fact that this war language that has been followed by real action um, along the lines of, use of force. There's an invasion. There are alien enemies. Uh, Foreign terrorist organizations can be struck. Military force is deployed to address this problem. What I see as different is that first of course, there are issues happening in the United States, and many, much litigation happening before U.S. courts that concern these issues. But this attention to Latin America that Ingrid was saying, well, how did Latin America become so relevant suddenly? Is not taking place in the United States. It's taking place in the region. And I think that's a fundamental difference, first. And second, to the idea of, I mean, your question, suggestion to sort of forecast, which I think is fascinating, and I'm not sure I'm qualified to do this, but my concern is that whatever happens with how these events unfold, which is a challenge to the law of armed conflict, a challenge to international human rights law, a challenge to international relations, is a challenge to how Latin American countries among themselves, between themselves, understand their stance vis-a-vis the United States. And I think that might have a lasting effect. The fact that this transactional attitude that you're so clearly referring to is that some countries will say, well, too bad. You should have done something. You should have stopped those drug smugglers earlier on. And then I'm getting my $1 million and I'm building these mega prisons, not just in El Salvador. That's the first example. Ecuador just opened its mega prison just last month. Argentina has announced that they will build a prison that is called the Hell. That, and in Chile, the likely next president has said the Bukele model is a good model. We have to focus and take into consideration the human rights of the victims and not the criminals. That is percolating. It is happening now in Latin America. So what I see in terms of lasting effect, and hopefully we'll revisit this conversation and I'll be proven wrong. But my concern is that what may happen is that the division that we've been somehow kind of looking into the surface will just deepen. And if there was one thing that Latin American countries were proud of was this sort of, even though we're not a region that is integrated like Europe is, we haven't been able to do that. but at least we are integrated in the principles that we hold together. And that seems to be dissipating as we engage with the United States.
Ingrid, did you have a follow-up question?
No, I was thinking that might be a good place to wrap it up.
Great.
That was a very sobering and important last thought, Jorge. It really connects to your work in human rights because I've always thought of Latin America as having a very distinctive human rights culture, and to think that these sort of political divisions would then translate back into legal changes is an interesting one. Thank you so much, Jorge, for writing the essay, for your work on the board of editors for the American Journal of International Law, and for taking the time to offer your really helpful and interesting perspective.
Thank you both for organizing this and for your great leadership.